Okay, with that said, let's go ahead and transition to How Green Was My Valley,
Very
the
green.
next film in our Best Picture movie series. It is directed by John Ford,
Hmm.
and it stars Walter Pidgeon, Maureen O'Hara, Donald Crisp, Anna Lee, Roddy McDowell, and a bunch of others that come and go throughout the film. If you're not familiar with How Green Was My Valley, at the turn of the century in a Welsh mining village, the Morgans raise their coal mining sons and hope their youngest will find a better life. All right. Obviously, this film went on to win Best Picture for the
Hmm.
films of 1941. Brendan, I believe
Yeah.
you noted this was a first time watch for you.
This is one of those John Ford films I sadly haven't had a chance to see. So it's interesting to see it now in context of it being one of his earlier films and how it
Yep.
compares to some of his, classics. I guess this does sort of fall into one of his classics in a way, given the reputation that it did win Best Picture. Also, given the reputation, and we're going to talk about the elephant in the room. I'm surprised you didn't lay out in the plot synopsis. If you're not familiar with How Green Was My Valley, it beat Citizen Kane for Best Picture.
It did beat Citizen Kane. Yes, it
Yeah,
did.
yeah.
Um, and well, I guess I didn't want to necessarily lay it out that way because I am going to talk about it in my opening thoughts. Um, but
Okay.
yeah, it beat Citizen Kane and a few other really good films from that year. So
Mhm, mhm.
maybe we can talk about that near the end if we want to talk about the competition of it all.
Sure.
But I would kind of rather talk about the movie on its own terms first, especially given the last
W
segment right
well
before we got into
well,
this.
we I
So,
mean, yeah, I mean, of course, we're going to be as objective here as possible and talk about the film as a film and not what it competed against, and
yeah.
it was interesting going into this movie for the first time, since this was a first-time watch for me, thinking, "Is this movie's worst offense that it beat a better movie for Best Picture? Like, is that the worst thing about it?" And I was genuinely curious if the movie was going to, still work as its own thing rather than have that sort of looming
Yeah.
history over top
Hmm.
of it, right?
Yep.
And I guess we'll start there. We'll start with the movie itself, and given that this was a first time watch for me, how I felt about it. Um, I was disappointed. I was disappointed in the film, and I say that with a lot of sadness, really, because I still think this is a good movie, but the groundwork was there. A nostalgic trip down memory lane, coming of age kind of tale. This movie was tailor made for Brendan Cassidy. This is a movie tailor made
Hmm.
for me. It is so up my alley. And for the first, like, maybe 30 minutes, I thought this was great. I was really enjoying it. I loved its conceit. The use of voiceover narration I thought was really clever for a while because I actually love the almost unofficial, unreliable narrator of it all, that this was basically a memory lane more than anything else. It was a now older man looking back on his childhood in different segments. The movie kind of feels like vignettes because they're different memories. The problem I have with the movie is that it's not that it doesn't do a good job sustaining itself. I think if anything, my issue is I don't think it fully commits to what it sets itself up as. I think it has this really clever and tender and warm idea, but as it goes, it just starts to spin its wheels as a basic movie. And I don't think it
Hmm.
fully commits to making Huel, played by a really young Rodney McDowell, really the cipher here. He is meant to be the cipher in all of this, and I think that sets the movie up very well in that regard. But I feel like it abandons that for different things, and I don't think that's intentional. I think if anything, this is a movie that gets sort of lost in the usual trappings of a Hollywood epic of this time. And that's unfortunate because I think the setup is great. I love the story. I love the idea. I love the nostalgia of it all. I think the movie looks beautiful. I think John Ford directs the hell out of it. So there's a lot of great things there, performatively, visually, musically. I love the vibe of it all. It just narratively, I don't want to say the movie's tedious, like I said, I just don't think it commits to itself to really justify the great idea that it set itself up as. And I think it starts to lose steam because of that, and just really it loses the dramatic weight when we
Mhm.
see great moments between family members and pivotal emotional arcs conclude, and in literally seconds into the next scene, they're completely forgotten about. And
Mhm.
and I get that that could be kind of the memory like aspect of it, but the movie loses that sense of time because it doesn't commit to Huel as our cipher, and I found that really unfortunate. So I wanted to love it more than I did because I love the idea. It's the kind of movie that's tailor made for me. I just think it loses its way as it goes along.
Yeah, I'm with you. I don't love this film either. Sadly, I do think it's a weak Best Picture winner. Now, as I get into my thoughts, I do want to be transparent here
Hmm.
because I don't want to fall victim of stop turning art into sports.
Hmm.
And I think it's quite easy to do so since it's competing against some all time heavy hitters, as you noted, Citizen Kane,
Yeah,
the Maltese Falcon as well.
great movie.
Do I understand why people have an issue with How Green Was My Valley or a Coda winning when there are very clearly better films that deserve the Oscar? I do. I really do. I talked about that in the Coda segment earlier in the show. However, there is a big distinction between How Green Was My Valley and something like Coda, and that Coda, as I argued, I do think is a very good movie still.
Mhm,
That's why the turning art into sports thing is so frustrating because that is a film still worth celebrating and loving. How
mhm.
Green Was My Valley is not quite that. Even if its intentions are affable, I do think this is a film that has its heart in the right place. It's
Absolutely.
classic Hollywood storytelling. It has characters we like and root for. It's emotional at times. The problem is that it has no identity. It is five movies in one. On one hand, it's about unionization and working class politics. It's
Mhm,
also a movie about religion and the handcuffs it puts on relationships. It's a movie about grief and loss. It's a
mhm.
poignant coming of age story. And weirdly, at times, it acts as a comedy. The
Yeah,
boxing scene with the school teacher has no place here, but it is genuinely hilarious in a vacuum.
sure.
It has no idea. This film has no idea what it wants to be. It has a major identity crisis and it pinballs from one through line to the next without any precision or purpose whatsoever. It's
Mhm.
really hard to invest in these characters and the drama here when it bounces around aimlessly the way it does, even if each through line is compelling on its own terms.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe the biggest difference between you and I, because you talked about that as well in your opening thoughts. I
Mhm.
don't always love the craft to this film. The
Interesting. Okay.
cinematography, which won the Oscar for best cinematography, I think is fine. There are a few well staged shots, but I
Mhm.
don't think it's anything extraordinary, especially when you, and I don't always don't always love to do this
Mhm.
because it veers dangerously close to the whole sports thing. However, I don't think comparison is always a bad thing. And
Mhm.
there are other movies in that year in 1941 from a cinematography standpoint that are truly astounding, incredible,
And
or
certainly
even
more
the year before.
experimental as well.
Absolutely. I mean, last week we talked about Rebecca. Obviously, that came out a year earlier. From a
Mhm.
cinematography and editing perspective, that blows this
That's a
film
better
out
movie.
of the
You're yeah.
water.
Yeah.
So I don't think the cinematography is anything extraordinary. I don't think it's bad. I just don't find it anything of note.
I
It's
think
not
the
noteworthy.
I think the exterior shots are pretty special.
There are a few. Again, there
Yeah.
are a few
Y
well staged shots. I agree.
yeah.
I will give you that.
Yeah.
But on the whole, I think it's pretty standard filmmaking. But more than that, the acting here, I think, is a bit spotty as well. Like I don't love a lot of these performances, and I think it comes down to
Yeah.
maybe not the actors themselves,
That's what I was gonna say.
but
I don't think
more
it's their fault.
so the identity crisis of this film, because you have some of these performers acting literally
Mhm.
as if they're in this working class politics movie.
Yeah.
Then there's the movie about comedy, this film acting as a comedy at times. And these there are at least 2 or 3 performances here that are heightened to an insane degree. Like
Yeah,
really over the top.
thankfully, some of them are not in the movie all that much.
They're
Yeah,
not,
yeah.
thankfully. But when you couple that with how grounded this film is, like you think about the priest character and how that couples with one of the daughters here.
Yeah, Angarod, I believe.
Angarod? Is that how you say that?
I can't pronounce any of these names
I
as we
know
talk
they're
about.
really
They're Welsh,
challenging.
but
Yeah,
Maureen O'Hara as that sister you're
yeah,
talking about. I think she's definitely one of the high points from a
she's great.
performance
No, I
standpoint. She's
agree.
great.
Maureen
Yeah.
O'Hara is fantastic, but what a contrast between her performance or even Roddy McDowall here and some of these heightened supporting characters that are that almost come off buffoonery. Like they're from a Charlie Chaplin movie, except
Like
they're
the
talking
boxers
here.
that
Yes,
that
very
pick a
much
fight
like
with
that
the
scene.
teacher. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
Like
that was an interesting scene.
exactly. Like the contrasting tones here are crazy to me at times. So like it might be less on the performers and what they're tasked to do here.
I think so.
But either way, the performances are inconsistent. The sound design, it's 1941. Obviously, we can't expect it to be what it is today. But I think even by 1941 standards, it's a little choppy at times for me.
Hmm.
So like, I just think from a craft perspective, John Ford, who I love, he's made some incredible all-time films for sure.
Hmm.
This was clearly him before John Ford became who he was, I think.
Well, he had
And
Stagecoach under his belt before this too, so it's not like he was
which
incapable of
is
making movies.
incredible, but like
Yeah,
those two films are so wildly different.
that's fair. That's
You know
fair.
what I mean?
Hmm.
And I'm not, I guess, up to date in terms of the context of why he chose this coming off the heels of Stagecoach a few years earlier. Is this the next one? Because Stagecoach was 39.
I
So I
think
imagine this
there may
was
have at least
pretty
been one
close.
movie. Yeah, there may have at least been one movie in between them, but they are at least very close in proximity.
They're very close.
Yeah,
And Stagecoach is great. Like
yeah, that's a great movie.
a stunning film. And that's maybe another one. I didn't even think about that in terms of comparison here because I'm thinking about 1941 and these other best picture contenders here, at least of those that I've seen. But
Hmm.
even Stagecoach, man, that is an immaculately directed movie.
I agree.
And
I agree.
this feels so inferior, so inferior to that, in my opinion.
At times,
Uh,
it does feel kind of distant technically. Now, there, like I said, there are some great exterior shots where you can tell the John Ford that we've come to know is there. And I think emotionally, he is going for something that we've seen him do before. There are moments here where it's clear John Ford was always someone that Spielberg admired, right? Like you could
mhm,
definitely sense that early influence in even a movie like How Green Was My Valley. And I don't disagree with what you're talking about as far as the film having these massive inconsistencies. The movie is very consistent, but a movie like this, especially a coming of age film, we've seen movies that are kind of inconsistent in a way still work. A movie like Boyhood, for instance, is a movie that functions as a series of vignettes mostly. It has a meandering kind of pace to it, but each moment of that child's life has its own story to tell, right? Its own kind of sliver, its own kind of chapter. We've seen that work before. So why is it sort of lacking in this movie? And I think
mhm,
it does come down to that lack of commitment to its early stages of establishing a cipher, establishing
mhm.
a centralized figure to guide us through all of these things. And like I said, I really like the way it started, but then there are moments where it completely abandons that for really dramatic scenes between, again, going to mispronounce these names completely. Angarod, who is played by Maureen O'Hara, we mentioned her earlier, and the preacher, Mr. Gruffydd, played by Walter Pidgeon. They have a bit of a romantic kindling of sorts, but they have scenes together where Hugh, Roddy McDowall's character, isn't even present. It's like, oh, how are you reminiscing about these things? Like that level of detail and the specificity of that just makes it feel like it's not committing to its conceit. And then when Hugh is then taken to school and he has his own journey at school, being picked on by both the teacher and the students, it becomes a completely different movie in that regard. But it's like, okay, now we're finally we're starting to commit to what you pre-established, but you're already too late. And that's the thing. It lacks a cipher to guide us through all this. That through line is just missing, unfortunately.
No, I completely agree. And before I respond to that, I quickly want to note, because we have to remember early Hollywood, they made a bajillion movies a year.
They did, yeah.
So John Ford makes Stagecoach in 1939. He made 5 other movies in that time frame from 39 to 41, including,
of course,
and we should have noted this, The Grapes of Wrath, which
we
talked about briefly last week as well. So, and The Long Voyage Home, I think, is noteworthy in this as well.
The Grapes of Wrath, that.
Yeah.
For some reason, I thought that was 42, but you're right. That is 1940.
That is 1940.
That might be top 3 John Ford for me.
It's really great.
I love that one.
Yeah, it's very good. And there's a few other films in there as well from 1939 to 41.
Okay.
So How Green Was My Valley is, I guess, early-ish John, although he had made a bajillion films, honestly, before How Green Was My Valley, and obviously made a ton more afterwards. It's actually like kind of more in the middle of his career. However, that is to say, of all the John Ford films I've seen, I just feel like this is so distant from his ethos in terms of filmmaking or craft. And maybe it's because of the screenplay, so much of what happens here is on the interior, and I don't know how extravagant you're going to get in a mining village. It's supposed to be a little basic in that regard. I'm not saying that the cinematography is bad. I think it is kind of limited because of the setting and the time and place in which this story takes place. There are a few establishing shots, as you noted earlier, that are quite great, but it does feel very distant from John Ford in that regard. So
it's not as adventurous, which is not a bad thing. Like, I like the change of pace, and he's certainly maybe trying to challenge himself. Maybe we can assume or hypothesize that he's trying to challenge himself and do something a little bit different. Yes, because
it is very different from his notable works, for sure.
Right.
I agree. So I at least wanted to set that context there, because I don't think I articulated that well previously. To your point about the screenplay and the storytelling here, that is really my biggest problem here, is the jarring shifts in this film, where we see those early scenes with the sons and them standing up against the corporate politics that's taking place, and how that's counterintuitive to their father, who has, I guess, a somewhat prominent managerial type position at this mining company. He doesn't want to strike, but his sons do. That I do find very compelling. Like, there's an interesting political angle to the film, and then it just suddenly shifts into something completely different. And it starts being this movie about religion and the daughter. And honestly, as jarring as a shift as it is, I do, in a vacuum, also admire the religious subtext of this film.
I think
especially at the time.
Yeah, there are notions here that are pretty ahead of its time. I think
ahead of its time.
There are some forward-thinking things here. I have to give the movie credit on that.
I agree. Like, on its own terms, those sequences here are incredible, because this film and you got to think 1940s, the country was still, I mean, if we want to dub the United States a Christian nation now, and I don't know if we can at this point, but it very much was in 1940. And this is
Yeah.
a film that you could almost call anti-religious, which
Kind of, which is that's a
is
broad
an
statement.
interesting irony. I mean, not
Bold
just
statement, rather.
yeah. And you think about the religiosity of the setting in which this takes place as well. You know,
Mhm.
it's not that the United States has a monopoly on religion. It obviously
Right.
very much does not.
Right.
But, you know, us living here in the States, it's
Mhm.
interesting to think about this film coming out and it having this anti-religious ethos to it, and yet it
Mhm.
wins Best Picture. Like, that's incredible to me. Like, that's
Well, maybe
just
that was part of it.
astounding.
You know, we have seen movies win coveted awards because they had a boldness to them. And
Yeah.
maybe there was a more immediately recognized boldness to this one as opposed to something like Citizen Kane, which was really bold, not just emotionally and dramatically, but from the filmmaking side of things was very experimental and very new. And that's a movie that
Yeah.
perhaps just took a little bit more time for Hollywood and us as viewers to recognize as being very bold and forward thinking in the
Yeah.
right ways. Uh, but it's easy to see a film like this at the time and think, and again, I say at the time, I was not alive in 1940, so I can't speak to it in that
Mhm.
way, but I can only assume that seeing something that says religion is bad for a Hollywood movie like this, you can immediately recognize that as being bold and daring. And
Yeah.
maybe that was part of the push that allowed a film like
Mhm.
this to win Best Picture. Because I love that notion, and I love the capitalistic mindset that also supports the film. I think those are some great themes in and of themselves. Again, it's just that single cipher that's trying to tie these things together that I think it is sorely missing.
Yeah.
I think it needed to commit to one of two things in order to be successful. It either needed to maintain that sort of fragmented narrative propulsion that you're talking about, but really keep young Hugh, front and center because memories
Yeah.
can be very fragmented. That's probably the point of the movie. It's meant to feel fragmented because memories can be like that. They can almost feel jarring when you look back at certain things simultaneously. But then Hugh should have been more front and center to commit to that. So if they're not going to do that, then just tell a basic story from beginning
Yeah.
to end. Don't worry about the nostalgia of it all.
Yeah.
Like keep it a bit more practical in that way. And I feel like it's a film that tries to do both, and it doesn't succeed in that balancing act.
Well, I agree. I feel like the best movies that employ that tactic are about memories and their fragmentation
Mm,
have this ethereal filmmaking quality to it.
yeah,
And as an experience, you feel the film seamlessly shifting from one memory to the next.
yeah,
Whereas, as I noted in my opening thoughts, this is classic Hollywood storytelling.
yeah.
And I think that's why that boldness, as it relates to the religiosity of this film, might come off as bold, but it still feels familiar because the structure and storytelling of this film is pretty
This
conventional.
this movie needed a little bit more Charlie Kaufman.
It needed a lot more Charlie Kaufman. I agree, absolutely. So you think of Kaufman or Bergman, like some of these filmmakers, Tarkovsky, that are
Mhm.
really great at channeling memories in this opaque, transcendental,
Yeah,
vague way where it feels like you're floating through space
yeah.
and time.
Would still feel kinda nostalgic and tender
Yeah.
and loving and inviting,
Malik.
and yeah, actually, Malik would be great for this kind of material. He really
he
would
would
be.
he would
Yeah,
love this
yeah,
material.
yeah.
He could really take, especially being a religious guy himself,
Mhm.
could do this film a lot of good. Like his take on this story, I think would be fascinating.
In a
I would
way, I
love to
feel like
see it.
I think in a way he almost kinda has done this movie before. Like, there are sprinkles of Malik. You can notice this movie in various portions of his filmography. And not I don't know if that's official or not, if he was ever influenced by this movie, but
Yeah,
I could really see this falling into his wheelhouse, and we have to be
I agree.
careful because I don't want this to come off as saying that we don't like this movie because it wasn't the movie that we wanted or the movie that we think it should have been. If anything, I think the problem with this movie is that it promises something that it just doesn't deliver on.
Yeah.
And I think that's the biggest thing here.
Well, I agree that you don't want to talk about what you want out of this film, but I
Mhm.
do think it's fair to articulate why the film doesn't work because it's structured conventionally
Mhm.
when the promise of it, as you're talking about, relies on this fragmentation, but you
Mhm.
can't render cinematically fragmentation through these very jolting hard edits.
Mhm.
Like it makes for a very jarring experience
Yeah.
that is ultimately very underwhelming because we're
Yeah.
very quickly shifting from one tone to the next, from one narrative point to the next, and there's really not much to really cement them together, which
Mhm.
is why it's just weird when you go from a scene about grief and loss and in the next moment Hugh is in school and he's beaten up by the teacher, and then the next thing you know it's a Chaplin movie in the
Yeah.
middle of this poignant
No, it's like,
film
yeah.
about working
What's
class politics.
It's like, what's the thing that's like creating this jarring memory stream, right? Like,
Yeah.
is there a moment in the present day? I think it's like a 50-year-old Hugh who's narrating this. I forget the actual age that he calls himself. And first off, I love that we don't see adult Hugh in this. I love that that's kept
Hmm.
at a distance, kind of maintaining that promise that this could be a bit more fragmented in its memory, in its memory stream, if you want to call it that.
Hmm.
Uh, but I think we need uh, some type of, I guess, motivation that leads him to think about a memory in a certain way. So is something happening in the present day that then makes him look back on that fight with his teacher in a
Yeah.
Chaplin like
Yeah.
way? Like what changes for him? And there are times I've even forgotten that there were voiceover narrators in this movie. It gets to a point it just completely abandons that. And I like the way it sets that up. I actually think this movie could have gotten the voiceover thing pretty right.
Well,
Yeah,
and
I
here's
don't know.
I agree with you. The unseen narrator, I think, is an interesting tactic.
Yeah,
But again, going back to the basis of this conversation and the idea that it's five movies in one, there's a massive contradiction there.
yeah.
Because if this is supposed to be from the perspective of Hugh, how on earth does he have any context to a lot of the things we see here that are not from his point of view?
Well,
Like, not even close.
that's the thing, because on one hand, I could buy into the fact that, okay, as a literal man now, he knows what was happening and he can look back on it with that context and the education that he has formed over the years. The problem is that many of these things that he's telling us about, he's not even in the scene for. So it's like he
Exactly.
wasn't even present for these moments, and
Yeah,
that's the inconsistency there.
exactly. And that's what makes the experience all the more jarring. Now, if
Mhm.
the film provided that context, if we went back and forth between these, these memory montages and how that correlates to him in his present time, in his present future,
Yeah.
then okay, I can understand how the film could make that correlation because
Yeah.
that context makes sense of what we're seeing on screen. But we don't know. We have no idea. The present Hugh is completely unknown to us. All we know is that he's an adult
The
and
movie just
he's
feels so
looking back at
incomplete
his
to me.
childhood.
Yeah.
That's it. And
The movie
that's
feels
not
so
enough to make
incomplete.
sense
Yeah.
of that lack of context.
Yeah. It just feels incomplete. Like,
Yeah.
the more I think about it, I again, I don't know if this was the movie that was intended, if the final product is what John Ford and screenplay writers were hoping for, but it really does feel like there are gaps here.
Yeah.
It got to the midpoint where I started to realize I'm missing something. I love the setup. I love how it was promising itself as something, and for a while, I loved how it was kind of unfolding like a storybook. For a while, the only words that we can actually hear was adult Hugh narrating this thing.
Hmm.
Very rarely you would actually hear characters in the movie in the story he's telling us. Very rarely do you even hear them speak. You'd see them speak, but
Yeah,
you didn't actually hear anything from them. And I actually thought that was a really clever touch. I could have seen a whole movie like that. I thought that's a
sure.
really interesting idea, and that could have been that cipher that brings us in and adds some connectivity here.
Yeah.
But it abandons that and then just becomes a movie, for
Yeah.
lack of a better term.
Hmm. Yeah, and honestly, like the more we talk about it, and I don't want to keep beating a dead horse
Yeah,
because these sudden narrative shifts, I think, are woefully executed here. Like they're just not
yeah,
interwoven very well. But I think what makes it disappointing is that there is something bold about this film. Like it
yeah,
has a backbone that I deeply admire. I
yeah,
really do.
yeah.
Because we talked about the religiosity of the film, but even as it relates to Hugh, like there's
Mhm.
a scene here where he is injured and the stakes are he may never walk again.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
this is a film that's not afraid to put its central characters in peril, especially a young child.
yeah,
And even after he recovers from that, we noted the scene earlier about him getting his rear end completely annihilated from his
yeah,
teacher, which sounds awful to say. Like my
yeah,
phrasing there was terrible, but you understand what I mean. Like he
yeah,
just gets absolutely destroyed by his teacher. It's not afraid to show that to us physically, which is what makes the boxing scene, I guess a little satisfying to see him get a little bit of revenge there. It again to me it's the tone of it because it's so comedically driven and
yeah.
it plays like a
No,
true comedy, which
yeah.
is
And now we should
so
be clear.
weird.
The boxing scene we're talking about is the moment between the adults from the Welsh community that they're from and the
Yes.
teacher in the
Yeah.
classroom.
Yeah.
Because the boxing scene before that between Hugh and the bully is actually a very good scene. But it's also representative of my problem with the movie in totality. Because you have this great moment of catharsis against a bully, and in doing so, he actually earns that respect. He has to get whipped for it. He has to put
Yeah.
the guard to bite down on, and even his bully is saying to him, "Bite down harder. You got this." Essentially,
Yes.
but like
Yes.
that's
I
a
love
great
that
moment.
moment. Yeah.
But that's great setup for something else to come between the two of them that we never get. Like
Exactly.
yeah. So
It,
that's
it never
it's
goes through on
like
that. I
that scene
agree.
right there is a perfect representation of everything that we're talking about. That's good and problematic about this movie.
I agree. I feel the same way about again. I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, Angerard,
Hmm.
and the priest character. Like there's some great setup that the film doesn't really fall through on. We do get that final moment where the
Hmm.
priest talks about why they can't be together. So there's at least some closure, but I also feel like there's a lot left on the table as far as what that whole through line could have been here. Like,
Yeah.
we talked earlier about the boldness of that being in the film, but it's also like maybe 15% of this movie. Like it's
Everything's
such a
15% of
small
this movie.
and that's the thing. Like there's great elements here, but it's ultimately a small part because it's five movies in one and it's trying to follow through on its
Hmm.
promise of being five movies in one.
Yeah.
And so a lot of these things suffer, but there are those bold, great moments. And another one I think of is the ending to this film, which it ends on this moment of devastation and heartbreak. And
Hmm.
I admire that the film is willing to go there. I don't know if it's as affecting as it could have been because the characterization is muted ultimately.
Hmm.
But I think it does work because of, to be fair to John Ford, the staging of that moment and
Hmm.
the performances are really good there.
Yeah.
So like as far as making those final moments come together, like yeah, there's a dolefulness to this film that I do admire and appreciate. I just wish there was more structure to its fragmented mindset.
it needed something to connect those fragments, and
Yep.
that's what's missing here. And that's so unfortunate because I said in my opening thoughts, this is the kind of movie that's tailor made for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I am emotionally susceptible to movies like this, coming of age tales that are nostalgic trips down memory lane about your hometown. It's why I love a movie like Stand By Me so much, one of my all-time favorite movies. This has a similar ethos to it, and it's just missing something as we keep talking about. Weirdly, the movie I was most reminded of while watching this, it's a movie that tonally is completely different, but I think narratively shares a lot in common. Have you ever seen Spike Lee's Crooklyn?
Yeah, a long time ago.
There's a lot narratively similar between that movie and this one, even right down to its tragic ending.
Mm.
But again, that's a movie that kind of meanders. Crooklyn specifically, it's very loose. It sometimes shifts perspectives. It's not in a more natural setting like in Wales, obviously, but
Sure.
it does treat its its setting like a character. It does have a very defined sense of place, but it is a movie that I think takes a similar approach and actually does it successfully. So, a movie like this could work. The fragmentation itself is not the problem. It's the gaps that are not tying those fragments together that's sorely missing here, and I needed more of that. I really did.
I agree. I agree. I sadly just I don't love the movie not because it won Best Picture. Again, to be crystal effing clear on that. It has nothing to do with it winning Best Picture. It has everything to do with the execution on its own terms.
I'm with you.
And that to me is the difference.
Yeah.
And why I think it's saddening that it won Best Picture. Now, I know there are fans of this that people do really like it, and I'm glad that people do like it. But
I've noticed
yeah,
that too. Yeah.
yeah, when it comes to 1941, though, there are several movies here that I much prefer to How Green Was My Valley, including Kane, obviously, The Maltese Falcon.
Love that film.
What do you think of Hitchcock's Suspicion in relation to this conversation? Have you seen that one?
A long time ago, and I remember being rather underwhelmed by it.
Yeah.
I'd have to revisit that one, but again, that's college Brendan who saw that one. So
It's hard to say like how
it's
you
a
feel
that,
about it now.
I say that kind of facetiously, but I also don't. That was a very different person.
Yeah.
So,
Of
but
course.
yeah, but I do remember being pretty underwhelmed by it.
Yeah.
I saw
yeah.
I saw it around the same time I saw Rebecca for the first time, and I remember loving Rebecca a lot more.
Yeah,
and I still really like Rebecca, even despite the conversation that we had. But I remember preferring Rebecca.
Yeah. I don't love Suspicion either. Again, haven't seen it in years.
Yeah.
So it's hard to say how differently I would respond now. But I feel like How Green Was My Valley is kind of more on that level than some of these others that are listed here.
Yeah. Because I really like Citizen Kane as much as everyone else probably does. And The Maltese Falcon, that's a great movie.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Have you seen any of these others nominated here?
I have to pull up the list. You might want to start just saying
Sergeant York.
Haven't seen it.
The Howard Hawks film. I honestly,
No.
I think I saw that in college too. But I don't know. That was I'm old, Brendan. That was a long time ago.
Yeah, you're 72.
Yeah, well, that was 20 years ago for me. Oh my god.
Yeah, I'm pulling up the list right now. But yeah, of course, Maltese Falcon. That's a great movie. Haven't seen The Little Foxes. Haven't seen. Oh, I think I've seen One Foot in Heaven. Actually, I got to think about that. That may have been another college film for me.
Yeah. Kane and Falcon, though, at the very least, that's my 1-2 punch. I know, hot take to say that.
Yeah, well, I mean,
some of these others, though, I'd
yeah.
love to catch up with some of these. I sadly ran out of time. I really wanted to try to catch up with a few more of these, but
Same here. Yeah, sadly, with this Best Picture series that we're doing, you can't do all of the homework for comparison's sake.
No.
It's just that's an impossible feat, and we haven't seen all of these.
Yeah, it'll be a little bit easier when the homework reduces from 10 to 5.
Yeah.
Especially because in a lot of these years, I've already seen, a bunch of these movies anyway.
Yeah.
So.
Or when we get to another decade later on down the road, we've already seen those movies because they're just engraved in pop culture, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes the homework's already
I'm just
there.
looking at 1950, for
Mhm.
example. All About Eve, I've seen. Father
Yeah.
of the Bride, I've seen. Sunset
Mhm.
Boulevard, I've seen. I'd have to make time for 2 other movies.
That's more doable.
a little bit more doable. Yeah,
Sure.
absolutely.
Sure. Yeah.
So, but right now we're rocking with 10 nominees. I just
Yeah.
don't have
So,
time
some
to
of
watch
them,
all 10
some
in a
some of
week.
them who've kind of faded with time, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's
exactly.
that too.
But at any rate, yeah, I just there are things I like about How Green Was My Valley. I don't love it. I don't love it.
I still like it overall because I like what it's going for, and
Yeah, I don't think it's not the worst thing I've ever seen.
no, but
Like
but
it's
even
not.
yeah, I've seen movies in this sort of genre or category, if you want to call it that, that I don't think are necessarily good movies, and yet they still move me in some way.
Yeah.
Like I said, I'm emotionally susceptible to these kind of movies,
Sure.
and they're going to work for me in some way.
Mhm.
This one, it still does. Like there are scenes here I'm going to rewatch. There is a rewatchability to aspects of this movie. There really is, and there is a charming and tender quality to it that I really do like. I
Mhm.
just don't. I think it's one of those cases where the movie as a whole is what less than the sum of
Yeah.
its parts. I guess that's how you say it.
Yeah.
That's what this is to me.
Yeah. And look, if you love this film and you tweet about it, I promise you I'm not going to be in your mentions ruining your party.
Citizen Kane, Citizen Kane,
I
Citizen
don't
Kane.
like it might
How
inspire
dare
me to
you
have
knock my beloved Rosebud?
it might inspire me to create my own tweet separate from yours, but that's it.
Oh, a subtweet?
Yeah. Well, it's I mean, again, because I'm not tweeting at that person.
Right,
I'm just
right.
taking inspiration from the idea.
Sure.
And that's different.
That is very different. That's a fair point.
fine.
Yeah.
Or
that's
if
a
you
fair
want to
point.
have a one-on-one conversation about it, I'm willing to have that as well. But
Yeah,
I don't
fair.
want to jump into someone's mentions and just ruin their day. Your take is awful. Goodbye. Like, okay. I mean,
To be fair, I'm not saying Brian is one of these people who we talked about earlier, but some people who make those claims are looking for those kind of comments, and you're making their day by actually commenting
for sure.
in the first place. Yeah.
And that's the difference with Brian.
Yeah.
And those that don't know him, maybe they could see it as that. I promise you, Brian comes from a sincere and earnest place. He
Absolutely.
is not
He's not that person.
bait clicking at all.
No.
Like he's not trying to bait you. This isn't Tom Hardy, Mad Max Fury Road.
No.
That's
no.
not at all what he's doing. I promise you that.
Oh, that'd be something.
Yeah. At any rate, if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here, if you're watching on YouTube, leave a comment below. If you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, however you listen, you can reach out to us on social media.
Yeah.
Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd. We would love to know how you feel about How Green Was My Valley.
Yeah.
We are 2 movies down in this series.
Mm-hmm.
And I look forward to getting to the rest of them.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of interesting ones on the horizon.